the landscape and its cultures to fascinate and engage. So even though this time is mainly indoors, still it's hard to ignore the setting we're in. I have two distinguished speakers. I will introduce each one of them in order. First, Todd Groth, who I've had the pleasure of knowing for a number of years, and who had the great good fortune as a senior graduate student to be earmarked for as J.D. Jackson's successor on a sort of an ad hoc basis initially, but then got a position and formalized this really, I think, very important component of education in a school such as the College of Environmental Design at UC Berkeley. And for those of you who saw the film last night, you saw him as a junior professor. He is now just Professor Emeritus of Architecture and Geography at Berkeley. I'm sure many of you are familiar with his writings, and also he leaves a great legacy of graduate students that he has mentored and is continuing to mentor over the years, who have contributed much to the study of ordinary things. So Paul, a great pleasure.
Thank you, Richard, and thanks to the conference organizers and to all the people in the audience as well. Having you here is making what we're doing much more fun. I've written this talk to take 25 minutes. However, I should warn you that because I stutter, actually giving this 25-minute talk could stretch well on into the afternoon. So that's just a risk we take together. Let's see here. John Rickerhouse Jackson's 35-millimeter color slide and the systematic yet idiosyncratic ways in which he organized those slides are vivid windows into how Jackson thought about American landscapes and what he looked for as he traveled around the country. Jackson seems to have been a reluctant photographer. For most of his life, he had actively used drawings, not photographs, to study cultural landscapes. Yet photos were there too in his methods. We know he learned to study aerial photography and maps during World War II. In his 17 years of publishing Landscape magazine, he encouraged his authors to illustrate their articles with photographs, and on his page layouts, he often added the photographs of other people and his own drawings, but not his own photos. He began to take and use a few of his own slides during the 1950s, and he took slides in quantity starting in 1970. So why in 1970 do we see Jackson's sudden change of heart about taking photographs? The major push came from the demands of teaching and lecturing. Some of the earliest slides from 1963 coincide with the year that Jackson began teaching a graduate seminar in the Department of Landscape Architecture at the University of California, Berkeley. By 1967 and 68, respectively, Jackson's courses at Berkeley and at Harvard had moved from seminar-sized enterprises to lecture classes for 200 and 300 students. He was also being asked more frequently to give public lectures. In short, the challenges of addressing hundreds of listeners greatly increased his personal use of a camera. Later, he began to use his slides as visual notes, as sets of ideas that he stored away as he studied new landscape elements and prepared essays about them. For effectiveness with a large crowd, Jackson's slides score high points. They are taken in excellent light conditions, always have a tight frame around his subjects, and they tell a story. Consider, for instance, this photograph that shows in one image virtually all the parts of an Idaho farm. In fact, all the parts of the Western American farm after 1870. The buildings all date from the early 1900s. The white two-story house here in the late afternoon light stands in its own fenced yard. The barn and outbuildings define a former work yard, now covered in grass, unused. An old windmill and a tall evergreen tree, windmill tree, lean at the same angle. In the background is a huge hillside field, freshly plowed. In a surprisingly large proportion of the foreground, this area here, is the straight gravel section line road of the U.S. rural grid, an important aspect of rural American life. Jackson had walked across the road in order to include it. Even when Jackson used slides to illustrate his lectures, he did not do so in the manner of art and architectural historians. He most often lectured with two paired images always on the screen. Instead, Jackson would typically lecture without slides for 35 to 40 minutes, forcing his audience to conjure up mental images of their own, from their own experience. Then, at the end of his talk, Jackson would show 5 to 7 images that highlighted and reviewed his points. Talking first, then showing slides, was a brilliantly circuitous way to teach designers and geographers. Jackson suggested first how to think, and then how to connect the eyes to the brain. To arrive at those few most telling photographs, Jackson eventually assembled a collection of close to 5,000 slides, about a tenth of which were copies of images from books and magazines, or images given to him by students and colleagues. Many of the slides of New England, like this one, could have been taken on day trips out of Cambridge, Massachusetts, during the years Jackson taught at Harvard. When he traveled with others, they made a point to give him copies of their best photos. We know that in 1985 and 86, Jackson, impressed by the work of the Albuquerque photographer Miguel Gander, hired him to take slides of the everyday lives of people in the Southwest. These were for lectures that Jackson was to be giving at Rice University. For a week, Jackson and Gander traveled together in and around Santa Fe and Albuquerque, Jackson pointing out what he wanted and Gander adding his own ideas. Jackson eventually selected about 100 slides out of over 1,000 that Gander had shot and included them in his home slide collection. On one occasion, on a later occasion, when Janet Mendelssohn's film crew was shooting with Jackson, he arranged for Gander to accompany the film crew, saying, "Go with Miguel, he knows what I see." Cross-country trips, usually taken alone, were the source of most of Jackson's slides, with some interpolation using automatic slide dates on the cardboard mounts. One can piece together routes that Jackson traveled between Harvard and Berkeley and then back to Santa Fe. And for the Southwest and Mexico, it is clear that Jackson carried a camera along on many short trips, carefully piecing together his visual thoughts of those close-to-home areas. We're looking here at a slide that was labeled simply under monuments. It's clearly a Civil War battlefield. I think it's Gettysburg, but I'm not sure. No. In order to move the slides with him from Harvard to Berkeley each year, Jackson stored his collection on transparent sheets the size of a piece of paper with 20 slides per sheet. The sheets were 3-hole punched and kept in a series of 18 3-ring binders. Some of the binders were very thick, holding a dozen or more pages of slides. Other binders were thin, with only 4 or 5 pages of slides. On the spine and front of each binder, Jackson wrote a few summary terms to help him find the more specific topics on the sleeves inside. When Jackson retired from teaching at Harvard, he gave some of his teaching slides to his successor there, John Stilwell. A few years later at Berkeley, he gave another large share of his slides to me, along with his lecture notes and a Xerox of his bibliography cards that he had used to prepare his lectures and his first book, American Space. What struck me most at seeing Jackson's slides was the way in which he had organized the slides. They were not kept in the order he used them in his lectures, but they were much more like the way he had organized his bibliographic card, which you see an example of here. I'll let that stay for now. Jackson stored his slides in 96 categories of landscape elements, often with several sheets under any one category. That is, a sheet labeled Churches 1 would be followed by Churches 2 and Churches 3. The front of the binder headings were typically more general. In one binder, which he labeled Maps, Plans, and Air Views, which you see here on the left, he included sheets with titles like Local Maps, Maps USA, and others. So those are the sheet titles. The binder labeled The Strip included not only categories one would expect, such as travel, hotels, and gas stations, but also other transportation, ships, harbors, airports, hotels, vehicles, bridges, something not close at all to the Strip. But in Jackson's mind, he clearly saw all types of regional connections as related ideas. A separate binder, labeled Roads and Highways, had sheets with 11 other roadside elements, such as road construction, official signs, truck stops, and highway ecosystems. Oddly, although perhaps not so oddly, since strict hierarchy and logic were not characteristics that Jackson's values highlight, the actual sets of pages about the Strip were in a different, fat, cloth-bound binder whose spine, after some editing, was eventually labeled Strip, Commercial Signs, Small Towns, Strip Signs, Rural Centers, and Sports. Over time, Jackson moved some categories around. The binder heading Mobile Homes was crossed out on the second binder labeled Strip. Jackson had moved the two sheets labeled Mobile Homes to one of the binders labeled Domestic Architecture, and that's where he left them. And it tracks a change in his thinking and writing. Initially, Jackson saw and wrote about trailers as an exceptional symbol of mobility. Later, he came to see them not as an exception, but as an intertwining part of the centuries-long history of a great many kinds of temporary dwellings in both Europe and America. No matter what the category in which he eventually filed his slides, Jackson the artist also worked as Jackson the documentary photographer and instructor. His slides are often arresting and provide riveting views, but he rarely kept an image that might be seen as merely picturesque. Jackson may not always have completely stopped his black BMW motorcycle to take a slide, causing them to be blurry, or his camera focus in this case might not always be sharp. But even this slide, as a lesson in how to see the landscape, he was fascinated, I'm sure, by this pickup truck and this RV trailer crowding the driveway of a suburban house. See, for instance, his 1987 photograph of a small village church near Santa Fe. Jackson includes the dramatically backlit traditional adobe church with its 3 crosses and spires here, and a separate bell tower there in the churchyard. Yet he frames the view with thoroughly modern elements. Dominating the foreground is a large satellite dish and protected by its own chain link fence. On the other side is the bed of a pickup truck. The steeples and satellite dish all point to the sky as past and present connections to the cosmos. The gravel plaza shines in the sun, and for all we know, the plaza may have been what caught Jackson's eye. Jackson classified this image not under churches, not under television, but under New Mexico. This cluster of elements together spoke to him about key ideas of New Mexico village life as he found it in 1988. 1907. In a 1971 photograph of an L-shaped apartment building in Holyoke, Massachusetts, with a fairly imposing brick facade, Jackson takes his view from the side to reveal wooden stairs and laundry line. His category is tenement houses. As he does with so many of his urban views, Jackson's 1984 photograph of downtown Boston, classified appropriately under city views, includes the juxtapositions one sees in everyday life. He prominently foregrounds an orange pickup truck with a white camper van top, and a woman in a green raincoat off here. Jackson often kept vehicles, streets, parking lots, passers-by in the forefront of his slides. The open spaces of America, located in the binder fields, lawns, parks, landscaping, and commons, were important to Jackson, and this binder held a high number of slides compared to the others. In addition to the cover categories, inside Jackson placed streets, street life, shopping centers, and vendors, but even though lawns is on the cover, lawns was not inside the binder. An unlabeled binder held another set of categories close to Jackson's heart, sheets about rural social institutions, such as churches, camp meetings, and schools. Why was the binder unlabeled? Well, perhaps it was the first of the binders, and hence it needed no label. As was true in his writing, Jackson enjoyed humor and irony. He might simply record jokes that people had already added to the landscape, as with the highway strip Dairy Queen managers in 1971, who have added to their corporate sign the message, "Stop now, the next 5 restaurants are mirages." Consider the irony of an early 1900s small-town bank with an exquisite Greek revival cast iron facade, which in 1977 Jackson found in use as a Honda motorcycle shop. Jackson filed the slide under monuments. He probably also liked the fact that there was a snowmobile edition on the side. When I first received, I'm sorry, I'm ahead of myself here. When I first received and studied the slide collection in 1978, the 80 slides in the pages labeled monuments were a puzzle. Jackson had not yet written or lectured on this topic. But a year later, he returned to the Berkeley campus to give an evening lecture, which he later published as The Necessity for Ruins. And this lecture made clear his interest in monuments of all types, although his end-of-talk slides were entirely different from the slides then stored in my office. This was, for me, the first proof that by this time in his career, Jackson was using his slides, as many scholars of the built environment do, as visual notes and research tools. It also suggested that he still had a substantial number of slides at home and was still adding to his collection. Many times in his teaching and writing, Jackson returned to the topic of the single-family house. And by far, houses made up the largest number of slides in any single category in the collection. About a sixth of Jackson's images were in 2 fat binders labeled Domestic Architecture 1 and 2. Inside these binders were slide sleeves with 6 subsidiary categories of their own. Mobile homes, as noted above, porches, and roofs. The rest of the pages simply collected single-family houses under domestic architecture in chronological order. However, if we collect all of the dwelling-related slide sleeves from their various binders and put them in a single list, we get a better idea of the range of Jackson's interest in the home. In those slides, Jackson often records the dignity and pride shown by individual homeowners. In an undated photograph, labeled merely techno-style, one of his 2 lecture categories for middle-class houses, he shows an early 1900s cubic house in the late fall with an ample porch with pairs of columns and an immaculately maintained front yard. Not a leaf in that front yard, but notice there are leaves here on the street. In a category separate from domestic architecture, Jackson placed a large number of slides under vernacular houses. These were usually very small, blue-collar homes, either self-built or minimally provided by mining, factory, or ranch owners for their employees. But Jackson's eye was not only on the simplicity or smallness or meanness of a one-room or two-room dwelling, he was also usually documenting some local, individual addition to the scene. In his 1971 photograph of two miner shacks in Groth, Arizona, the minimal wooden dwellings, you see here, are flanked closely by other structures. In the immediate background is a steep, eroded hill, probably a slag heap or the edge of a tailings pond, since a smelter smokestack is off to the left. But within this otherwise grim scene, the residents of one of the houses valiantly have planted a small palm tree. And that may be why Jackson took this particular picture of the vernacular house. Frequently, Jackson looked for traces like these of individual actions played out within broader economic and social forces and ideas. Another way Jackson used the term vernacular in his writing was in regard to the informal, temporary ways that people used and claimed space for their own purposes. The examples might be a garden, people parking various vehicles in unusual places, children doing acrobatics on a front yard, or youngsters adopting an empty factory, as we see here, as a factory parking lot to play ice hockey somewhere near Boston. Although a substantial share of Jackson's survey courses addressed 20th century American cities and the houses in them, especially in the suburbs, his slide categories for other aspects of the city, especially the central business district, were much more tentative. No binder collected most of the urban landscape elements. Highway strips, factories, and public gathering spaces each had their own slim notebook of side sleeves. Jackson scattered the rest of the history of the 20th century city in many different volumes. One unlabeled binder held slide sleeves with the categories lodges, clubs, fraternal, etc., banks, stores, office buildings, warehouses, and parking. Inexplicably, this binder also had a sheet of slides labeled light and color, a Jacksonian touch. In a different unlabeled binder were New Deal projects, streetcars, and urban transportation. On the basis of this evidence, at least, it's safe to say that the central sections of American cities, with their more corporate and congregate landowners and builders, did not interest Jackson nearly as much as the outlying areas, where he could observe the impact of individual investors and occupants. For his bibliography cards, here's an index to them, one page of a 4-page index. Jackson used almost exactly the same system of 90-plus categories he used for his slides. There's nothing magical about Jackson's categories, but they do show him at work, teaching himself how and what to see. His lectures and essays, usually published without notes, made his sight knowledge seem easily acquired. But his expertise and vision were constructed, hard-won skills. The slides and their categories also display with ease, with which J.B. Jackson moved between, on one hand, literally hundreds of local individual examples of a building or sign or an open space, and on the other hand, much more generic and abstract landscape types. As Jordi Ballesta's exhibit shows, Jackson had labeled almost every slide with some location cue, the city or state, perhaps the region. He did not care particularly when he took the slide or on which of his many trips across the country, but the abstract landscape types seem to have meant very much to him. He wrote, revised, and rewrote the categories for a great many slides. Jackson first labeled this 1965 slide, the small informal valley code, as Tennessee, then later as South City, and finally, Village. Filed on the slide page, Town. Note how Jackson was moving from the specific to the generic. Jackson was also reflexive, often keeping in view part of the rearview mirror of his motorcycle or the windshield column of his pickup truck, to record himself as the conscious observer and editor of the scene in front of him. In a slide showing what he called the roadside ecology of plants, which receive more water by the side of the highway than plants further away, he's careful to include his vehicle's rearview mirror. 2 years after he gave me his slides, he gave me the slides so I could continue teaching his subject at Berkeley. Jackson asked for his slides to be returned on loan because he was giving the survey course again as a visiting lecturer at the University of Texas, Austin. The following year, as promised, Jackson sent his slides back to me, but not in their sleeves. As perhaps a comment, I was taking his slides too literally or too carefully. He stacked the empty sleeves at the bottom of this large box and used the slides themselves as Excelsior-style packing around 2 19th century books on agriculture that he had borrowed from the Berkeley Library. As I say, Jackson didn't seem to put a particularly high value on his photographic art. That year's back-and-forth exchange of Jackson's slides also made clear that he needed some of the slides for the thinking and writing that he was still intending to do, and which he did do in more of his published collections of essays. When I began to return the slides to new archival quality sleeves, I found that Jackson had sent me an overlapping but different and larger set of slides than his first gift. The first set included roughly 1,800 slides. The second shipment was about 2,100 slides. Many pages were partly empty, even though earlier they had been full with slides. I knew because I had added catalog numbers to each image, so each time I used a slide, I could be sure to put it back exactly where it was. So knowing his life was going to be much more important than mine, I better keep track of how Jackson kept his slides. In 1995, Jackson gave another large set of 1,800 slides to Chris Wilson here at the University of New Mexico. And once again, they were loose slides. Wilson remembers they arrived in a Labatt's beer box. About half of the slides had my cataloging system labels, so they had been part of Jackson's initial gift to me. Wilson surmises that, like my set, these were primarily teaching slides. About that same time, a year prior to his death, Jackson forwarded to me a final set of about 1,000 slides, all still filed in their categories and transparent sleeves. When the boxes arrived, I opened them carefully, knowing that they would be a rare glimpse into that very private life of Jackson's study at his home in La Cienega. What had he kept near his desk as visual notes for present and past and future essays? In this view, you can see his desk where he sat, but note the slide sleeves, not far away. So the slides were at his hand until that last year. So what had Jackson kept at home? Well, a series of slides about different American regions, this one labeled under New England. Excellent slides, many copied from books, in the categories of farmsteads, fields, plantations, and sharecroppers. More than 100 slides of his drawing in watercolors. At least 60 slides of street life, and another 60 slides he labeled simply as urbanism. Here were notes for what he was thinking about the center city. He hadn't ignored it at all. The woman in the yellow coat here is taking on a huge glass facade. There were several more sheets of vernacular houses, but no more of the domestic architecture slide he had collected during his teaching years. 100 slides were labeled Southwest. But most of all, he had saved almost 200 slides of New Mexico, the region that had first inspired him to start his journal Landscape and that continued to fascinate him. The scattered fractions of J.B. Jackson's slides are currently being collected in one place, the J.B. Jackson Pictorial Materials Collection here at the Center for Southwest Research Museum and Library. with the assistance of Audra Belmore, the curator of the Jackson collection, and Jason Miller, the librarian of the Visual Research Center at the University of California, Berkeley. Jackson's slides are being digitized, and the cataloging is complete. The goal is for the complete collection of slides to be accessible through websites connected to both libraries. Audra reports that almost 1,000 slides are now available online. If there is a single theme that ties together all of Jackson's slides, it is his classic geographic fascination with the hand of humans on the earth. Even in those moments when he might be photographing a scene simply because of the beauty of light, color, and the composition of the visual elements, as he does in a 1971 slide of a highway, clouds, and sunlit landforms in the high plains of New Mexico, there is always a human element. The simple farmhouse to the left visually ties together trees along the stream and the gravel section line road crossing this way, all of which balance the dominant elements of a highway parallel by power lines. Again and again in J.B. Jackson's life work, one sees that his thinking and writing went together with looking and seeing. His photographs and their categories are a partial but an important record of the processes all students of the landscape hope for, learning from what we can see. Thank you very much.
That last shot is reminiscent of northeastern Kansas, where I taught for a few years in the late 1970s. Spring came out to lecture once, and we drove around, and as approaching one town, he said, "No hippies, no crafts, isn't it wonderful?" It's now my pleasure to introduce our second speaker, Jordi Ballesta, who I had the pleasure of meeting about a year and a half ago in the quest for his research on J.B. Jackson and photography more broadly on the ordinary American landscape. We have Jordi to thank in part as a partial catalyst for this conference and the work he's done in the Jackson archive, and we look forward to an exhibition he is mounting that will show in 2017, correct? In Paris and Montpellier, of a collection of Beyond Brink's slides of Donald Appleyard and Denise Scott Brown, David Lowenthal, Chester Leeds, Alan Jacobs, and me. Most of it, Chester excluded, very Berkeley. And it should be a very, he's thought long and hard about this, as I think his paper will indicate, and his remarks, I think, will be very welcome by all of us. So, Jordi, it's a pleasure to have you here and to listen to what you have to say.
I would like firstly to thank Chris, Eldra, and Kelly, all the team who take part in the organization of this conference and for their warmly hospitality. So, within the fields of geography, architecture, and cultural studies, John Brigham of Jackson is widely acknowledged to have a pivotal contribution to the study of American landscape. The originality of his theoretical approach and the evocative power of his writings are often cited among his key achievements in the study of inhabited spaces and vernacular spaces. However, to date, little has been written about Jackson's field experiences and ways of knowledge acquisition. Without a doubt, the idiosyncratic manner in which Jackson's professional career developed is one of the reasons for this gap. His activity cannot be contained within any one established category of knowledge. While he is often studied in the field of geography, his work presents value for historians because of his interest in diachronicization of the various habitations. Furthermore, by directly exploring, observing, and describing vernacular landscapes, he acted as a philosopher engaging with the world. His written output reflects this plurality, with most of his book constituting collection of essays regarding, among other topics, the frontier, the precarious habitation of the high plains, and the roadside landscape. Moreover, in keeping with his understanding of landscape, his research included a variety of built environment and scales, from pieces of land to wide geographic areas. To understand Jackson's thought, it is equally important to consider that he had a wide social network, but that he maintained at the same time a separation in his collaborations with distinct individuals active in publishing, research, and art. To give one example, Jackson collaborated with the photographer Peter Brown on a book project on the high plains for nearly 4 years. During that time, it seems that he didn't tell in detail any of his close friends or colleagues about the long essay he was writing. Besides, Jackson published text. His personal archive and photographs represent an invaluable resource for providing a comprehensive evaluation of his field research. In sum, these documents lead to understand the way he looked at places, met people, and questioned them. With this regard to Jackson's written archive, it should be noted that a diary of a road trip undertaken in January-February 1957 is the only substantial field written record he left. The diary provides a direct access to his experience of geographical and sociological facts which he observed. In order to better understand Jackson's thought, his letters, papers, conference presentations, and public lectures could be studied. However, I believe that only his photographs allow to fully comprehend the landscape practices he had developed during 3 decades. Nevertheless, we can't forget that Jackson did not consider himself a photographer, just as he did not consider himself only a geographer, historian, or philosopher. Understanding of his photography requires then a contextualization of these images within the visual and physical experiences, be it behind the wheel or on foot, captured with a camera or with the naked eye. Furthermore, Jackson's views on photography conveyed through his essays, lecture, and interview provide an equally important material. Drawing on this material, I wish to introduce 2 issues that lead to understand some of the main motivations behind his photography. First, I will focus on what represents one of his unique traits, its attachment to the method of the amateur. I will then discuss Jackson's experience of landscape and how it converged with his views of photography. To conclude this presentation, I would like to put forward a hypothesis concerning documentary value and vernacular quality of his photography. As we know, from those who personally knew him, Jackson attended experimental courses at the University of Wisconsin. before graduating from Harvard with a degree in history and literature. He then briefly studied architecture at the MIT and commercial drawing in Vienna. Sometime after this, he left academia to work as a cowboy. He then was a rancher from after the Second World War and until the early 50s. In 1951, Jackson founded Landscape, a magazine in which major academic figures have published. He taught in departments of geography, architecture, and visual studies, mainly during the 60s and 70s. Nevertheless, it is noteworthy that he espoused amateur way of studying the world. In a rare writing, Jackson explained that his field research had been influenced by the geographer Derwent Whittlesey, who taught him to observe the world and to draw conclusions for unimportant facts. Even more significant has been his exploration of European geography when he was an allied officer and his discovery of landscape habitat while he was a cowboy in New Mexico. At a talk in Santa Fe in the last years of his life, Jackson talked about his first long stay in New Mexico at his uncle's rancho. I quote, "I spent all year on the ranch and I helped with the landing, and then I went to work on a much larger cattle ranch in Cimarron. It was then that I decided to be a rancher. It was rough work at times, but I enjoyed the company of cowboys and going around to other ranches and meeting people. It was there I learned that the landscape individuality was not the scenery or the weather, but the men and women who lived there." For Jackson, the knowledge of landscape originates from an empirical relationship with his immediate surrounding and from a personal engagement with the local context. Even if he left the profession of cattle breeder in the early 50s, Jackson did not lose interest in the non-academic approach towards geography. In the first call for papers for Landscape magazine, he invited for submission original short articles that appeal to the intelligent layman rather than the specialist. This distinction between the expert and the curious was important to him, not least because he defined himself as an inquisitive layman operating on the fringes of academia. In 1986, on the occasion of an address celebrating 30 years of his encounter with Berkeley geographers, Jackson expressed his affinity with those who drift in and out of courses, cultivating their own field of interest, for those also who look for a new way of seeing and asking questions, as well as a new, profitable way of experiencing the world. In his address, he also promoted open-minded receptivity and availability, which he considers stemmed from the amateur approach. A few months earlier, in the context of a cycle of conferences he gave at Rice University, Jackson introduced himself as a student of landscape history, deserving the title of scholar. By describing himself as an amateur geographer at Berkeley and as a student of landscape history at Rice University, Jackson demonstrated his characteristic modesty, but most certainly he also means that he was looking for a research method as questioning the world by means other than erudition. Jackson felt unbound by academic convention. He most often opened new fields of investigation without producing exhaustive research. He certainly preferred amateur pleasure of learning to scholars' mastery of knowledge. In an author information form provided for the Yale University Press in 1994, Jackson noted that recognition of his work was based on his approach as an educated lay reader and on his experiences of everyday geography. As he wrote there, I quote, "I have always identified the visual, the ordinary, the commonplace. At the Rice University, he elaborated, quote, an amateur student of the landscape like myself is quite content to deal with one small element in landscape history, an element which is familiar to everyone. Assuming that Jackson's talk, text, and photograph are coherent, this interest in the minor and the common should be equal regardless of the kind of writing he used. It is also conceivable that his amateur approach toward research informed his photography. Indeed, thousands of Jackson's snapshots are similar to quick sketches in the sense of being both devoid of skepticism and bearing traces of uncertainties. Moreover, it seems that Jackson seldom consulted land or urban planning documents. Because of his predilection for the visual and the immediacy of note-taking, Jackson would have an empirical apprehension of the landscapes outdoors rather than choosing the interior space of research, such as archives, documentation centers, and libraries. For Jackson, photography had unique capacities to record, but also to facilitate opportunities of close encounters and in no way to create distance and to frame. Certain Jackson's photographs document some of these encounters in truck stops, in the field, on tourist sites, at flea markets, in a square where trees were being planted. For Jackson, fieldwork seemed to imply regular interaction, including conversation. The photography was for him one of the ways of getting in touch with landscapes, but also with its inhabitants. It was certainly also a way of keeping a note of the dialogues he had with local peoples and places in order to include them in essays and narratives. I would argue that Jackson developed his theoretical understanding of American landscape and its vernacular habitation a posteriori, when he had came back at his home at the Santa Fe County. However, I also argue that Jackson was above all a geographer when he engaged with landscape directly. 5 years on, Jackson has forsaken the idea of photography. Oh, no. Sorry. I'm here. For this reason, I believe that photography had had a profound influence on Jackson's research practice. Further to this, I consider that Jackson's conception of landscape relies upon diverse forms of writing, in which I include hundreds of words, but also the numerous captions in words he wrote on the slide marks. Moreover, I would like to draw attention to the fact that Jackson has devoted himself to defining an accurate idea of photography. In The Necessity for Rains and Other Topics, published in 1980, Jackson warned his readers of the technical and aesthetic poverty of his photographs, while also explaining that they were popular with his students. It was also because of his interest in photography that he decided to take part in the New Mexico Photography Survey in the early 80s. Sometime after, he collaborated with photographers Miguel Bandert and Peter Brown, and he wrote a preface to a monograph on Jodil. In his essay, Other Directed Houses, from 1956, Jackson discussed photography through a telescopic lens by the way of bearing witness to visual deterioration of the highway landscapes. At the same time, he believes that billboards and roadsides created a landscape that has a comforting effect and can constitute a basis for architectural and urban projects. It is interesting to note in this regard that camera's viewfinder seems to have a given structure to Jackson's vision, leading him to focus on distinct elements rather to embrace the whole view. 5 years on, Jackson has forsaken the idea of photography through a telescopic lens. This new vision was expanded in his article Images of the City, where he explained that the city dweller perceived his surrounding directly through a windshield, from a bedroom window, from a crowded sidewalk, on the way to the school, to the office, to the drugstore. 13 years later, in 1974, Jackson refined further this conception of photography as a medium that neither truncates nor distances, and which shows landscape from within rather than without. In his review of the book on Earth and Timbers Made, New Mexico Architecture, he proclaimed himself on the side of the photographic practices that make visible the building processes, inform the modes of habitation, and don't neglect the surrounding. For the same reason, he objects that to the graphic abstraction what he believed characterized on Earth and Timbers Made. From this critique, Jackson elaborated a stance towards photography that he will continue to defend from the 80s onwards. It comprised of, first, developing a visual experience anchored in everyday reality. Second, using a device that would permit the full range of visual observation. And third, taking images that would question reality rather than frame it. In 1983, Jackson published the essay Looking at New Mexico within the book The Essential Landscape. Here, he didn't discuss any photographs or photographers. Specifically, he distanced himself from the veneration of the West heritage, of the geological witness, and of the wilderness, which were the main topics of that he called the timeless tool of photography. With Looking at New Mexico, he implicitly defined a non-contemplative photographic practice, always attentive to potential instabilities. In 1986, Jackson further attested his predilection for photographic practices and concern with permanence and preservation. In a review of Phil Patton's book, Open Road, he focused on photography of road landscapes, and in particular on the works he regarded as thorough investigation of American car culture. In contrast to images enumerating abandoned gas stations, vandalized motels, and empty storefronts, he celebrated research grounded in intimate knowledge of the street and of their businesses, like franchise, Holiday Inn, drive-in banks, and all. He expressed his disinterest towards the photographers who seek out photogenic qualities and picturesque details. With his review of Open World, Jackson thus continued to promote a photography that asks will be rather than what has been. Jackson would offer a definitive evaluation of photography in 1992 in the only text he devoted entirely to this subject. Entitled Joe Deal and the Vernacular, this text introducing the book Southern California Photographs by Joe Deal. In just 5 pages of this essay, Jackson outlined their assumption, allowing us to envisage a photographic practice that would make it possible to document both present and future everyday habitation. Jackson's first premise is that photographing, I quote, signifies much more than seeing and recording an image. Photographic writing influences, in fact, the field experience. Jackson's second assumption is that photography is capable of depicting reality without sentimentality and describing the beginning of a landscape, the first gropings for form and permanence. Once again, according to Jackson, photographic writing encompasses rather than frames. It integrates what is yet to come. Jackson's third and final point is that vernacular photography should be more than documentary. The point was not to take photographs in order to just generate knowledge. Seen from this perspective, Deal's work belongs to vernacular photography. It will be grounded in amateur approach and it would confer a sense of proximity to the immediate surroundings. This is why, as Jackson explains, Deal's images are empty of people, but remind us of daily activities and demand that we participate in the world we make and live in. Deal's photography, of course, is in no way vernacular in the literal sense. Jackson simply used Deal's work to elaborate his own idea of photography, a documentary practice with potential for knowledge acquisition, but also a pursuit of an amateur practice as means of arousing curiosity in an unsystematic manner. In conclusion, I would like to quickly mention an interview between J.B. Jackson and Robert Calo that took place in 1988. During this interview, Jackson explained that his lectures at the university aimed at countering the depressing picture of the United States. He wanted to convey the affective point of view of the proprietorship endowed with historical knowledge, not as a philosophy, but as a way of seeing, experiencing, and interpreting everyday landscapes. This interest in the everyday not only allowed him to study what were usually neglected, but also to photograph it. In this manner, Jackson observed that opened a great many eyes to the fact that America had a lot of contemporary culture, common things that were worthy of photograph. He added, I quote, and photographers were very enthusiastic bakers because I took such dreadful pictures. They said, my God, it must have something back. So there were a lot of photographers that thought that I represented some new wave in photography. We can see that Jackson was a pioneer not only in the domain of research, but probably also in the field of photography. As he contributed to the establishment of contemporary vernacular as a subject of research, he also contributed to extend the field of study of certain photographers. Furthermore, I would like to stress that for Jackson, photographic record was not a short-hand method for taking film notes. On the contrary, photography allowed him to structure his geographic experiences. As an amateur and a student, Jackson did not seek to produce finished photographic work. Rather, using photography allowed him to make preparatory notes. Despite their poor legibility, Jackson's photographs should be considered as documentary works. At the same time, they should also be seen as vernacular, insofar as they constitute an invitation to an encounter, to play with circumstances, and because they rely on skill that cannot be learned. Thank you.
Okay, please I'm going to deviate in format a little bit, and rather than posing questions to our presenters, make a few comments which I hope will stimulate discussion between them and also subsequently in the audience. And since sometimes some translation is necessary, I'm going to try to make some of these points rather succinct and stop after each one, so our Italian translator can do that and then return to the next thing. This subject is very complicated in some ways. Brink, I think, was a great contrarian, and he took a certain degree of pleasure in being that, in bucking the tide, as it were. As popular as some of these subjects may be today, they certainly were not in the 1960s or even the 1970s. And he knew that, and I think he took a certain delight in opening up and exploring realms of inquiry that nobody else was thinking about, and that even if people were familiar with, they would take for granted and dismiss as inconsequential.
Je voudrais savoir si, est-ce que vous voulez que je traduise en français, les gens qui sont français? Oui. Oui. Donc en fait, plutôt que de poser des questions, il commente la personnalité de Jenny Jackson, et en fait il dit qu'il avait un certain plaisir de faire les choses pas comme les autres en fait. Donc le mot en anglais c'est contrarian, c'est-à-dire qu'il c'était sa personnalité de faire ça, et donc ces photos aussi montrent ça, c'est-à-dire que c'était pas un genre d'homme qui aimait faire ce que les autres faisaient à l'époque. Et on va faire plutôt que de faire comme la première fois, donc il va un peu parler, après je vais traduire, il va un peu parler, on va suivre ce système parce qu'on pense que ça va être plus simple.
He certainly had very definite ideas, but he was also certainly not a polemicist. If anything, he was open-ended and much more interested in getting people to think about things that they had never thought about, rather than coming to some predetermined conclusion or even agreeing with him. That wasn't the point. And I think the photographs that he took, the slides that he took, are very indicative of these qualities. At first glance, they're almost like snapshots, and you're wondering, well, can't you get out of a car and frame that? But that isn't the point in many ways. And while they appear to be casual, they're very carefully thought out in terms of what composition wasn't the objective here in the traditional sense of composition, but inclusion was. And these are very carefully considered in terms of what they include, much of which is, it may not be readily apparent. And I think both Paul and Jordi were very good about bringing some of these ideas to the fore, which even in retrospect, when we look at them, we don't necessarily see at first.
Donc en fait, le premier commentaire, c'est qu'en fait, c'est quelqu'un qui n'aimait pas la polémique. C'est-à-dire que bien qu'il ait des idées précises, il venait pas dès le départ avec son propre point de vue, comme un professeur, par exemple. Donc c'était sa personnalité. Et ce qu'il voulait vraiment, c'est que les gens découvrent quelque chose de nouveau. Et on a aussi l'impression, quand on voit ces photos, que c'est quelqu'un qui ne faisait pas vraiment attention à la composition de l'image. C'est-à-dire souvent, il reste dans la voiture, il ne fait pas vraiment l'effort, par exemple, de sortir de sa voiture pour faire une meilleure photo. Donc on a peut-être l'impression qu'il ne faisait pas vraiment attention à cause de ça, mais alors en fait, il faisait vraiment attention aux photos qu'il prenait, bien qu'on ait l'impression, pas toujours qu'il fasse, que la composition n'était pas vraiment bonne. Mais en fait, il avait vraiment une idée précise de ce qu'il voulait montrer.
So I think there's an inherent contradiction in these images, just as one can interpret that in the way in what Brink did. And he was an amateur, but he was also a man of letters. He was a very deep thinker. He influenced, and he knew he influenced deeply people in academics and practitioners in a variety of disciplines. And these images, too, which at a superficial level seem so impulsive and casual, are really not only the subjects of deep thought, but also, in some cases, in many cases, can be considered art. And if there was any way to summarize the incredible array and complexity of his contributions, it was simply to turn things around and give us a view that at first might seem contradictory to those that we had, but in the final analysis, makes wonderful sense.
Donc oui, il continue sur ce qu'il disait précédemment, c'est-à-dire que bien que ces images, on a l'impression qu'il y a un certain laisser-aller, parce qu'elles sont pas toujours bien cadrées, et malgré tout, c'était un homme qui était extrêmement éduqué, qui savait exactement ce qu'il voulait faire. Donc c'est une des contradictions de son œuvre, c'est-à-dire qu'on a l'impression que c'est un amateur, et en fait ce n'est pas un amateur, au sens qu'il avait vraiment une idée de ce qu'il voulait montrer. Donc c'est la contradiction dans ces photos.
Merci bien. I'm going to ask Jordi and Paul to comment, contradict, or whatever, and offer a few additional comments to the introduction or given.
I will try to speak in English, and if it doesn't make sense, I will switch in French. So I think it's true that it was not an amateur, but maybe he tried to keep this proximity of the amateur, this availability, as I told during my talk, and like an ethic, I don't know the ethic for this research. And it's true that there is a contradiction about his position as he explained it, and his writings, and his gift of writing. I don't know if my makes sense.
Est-ce que tu peux parler en français?
Oui, en fait, je crois qu'il y a une contradiction, bien sûr, entre ce qu'il a pu déclarer sur sa manière, ce qu'il a pu dire sur sa manière de faire des recherches, et effectivement la qualité des textes et la qualité de ses recherches. Mais c'est plutôt un positionnement éthique vis-à-vis de la recherche, et l'idée de rester toujours dans une position intermédiaire qui permet d'introduire plus des sujets de recherche plus que de l'éclat, et qui permet d'avoir une certaine proximité, une certaine disponibilité vis-à-vis du monde tel qu'il voulait le pratiquer.
As will be clear when we've heard from other speakers in this conference, Jackson starts as a photographer after 20 or 30 years of drawing. So I would counter one thing is that he does have very careful composition in his photography, and I think it comes from his drawing. Because he had learned there already the frame and to emphasize certain things. So again, some of the exhibits that we're seeing will show us again too the interplay between his drawing and his photography. So I think we both sort of left that out, but I think that helps the training of his vision was already done, or was in part done when he picked up a camera and started to add photography to the tools.
Ce que Paul dit ici, c'est qu'en fait, avant qu'il soit photographe, pendant au moins une bonne vingtaine d'années, c'est quelqu'un qui dessinait. Donc il avait déjà un très bon sens de ce qu'il voyait. Donc en fait, il dit qu'en fait, c'était les photos. Il avait déjà l'œil de quelqu'un qui savait dessiner quand il prenait ses photos, et ça informe ses photos. Il soit d'abord artiste.
Sounds so much better in French.
I should have expressed myself more clearly. I meant they seem uncomposed. They seem casual that way. He had one of his many endearing habits was when he was giving a lecture, especially to a professional audience, not a student lecture. He would preface some very original, very insightful idea with, well, now I'm sure you've all heard and know of this already, or something like that. It would be something brand new if he was there. And whatnot. So let's, Chris, when do you want us out of?
12:45.
12:45. So let's have a few minutes of questions, comments. Sir.
Dan Ariel. Hi, Paul. I thought one of the things that Paul mentioned that was most insightful, and it's been sort of nibbled at the edges here, is how Jackson appears to have had drawing as a way to represent for the self. And that it was only, from what I think Paul related, it was only when he decided that he was going to become a public educator, in the sense of his lectures, that the camera then became the tool for the capturing of that representation. I thought that was actually very, very interesting, and I'd be interested in your elaborating on that as one of his students.
Je vais traduire la question. En fait, Jackson, au début, utilisait le dessin. Et c'est seulement quand il a commencé à enseigner qu'il est allé, en fait, qu'il a commencé à utiliser la photo. Et quel est le rapport entre ces deux choses? Donc voilà la question.
Well, there's information yet to come, because Jordy has studied Jackson's photographs year by year, roll by roll, state by state, and he knows that he can do a bar graph of when the photographs were taken. And I was taking kind of a quick look, as usual, as is my want. And you know, in another year or two, when we put the real data together, we could actually see when the photographs start to appear. But my sense was about the time he was starting to teach, and that was a rough approximation. But you can see that he couldn't have shown his drawings. That would have been like, this wouldn't have worked. But he needed another medium. And by this point, he'd also been editing Landscape magazine.
In which his drawings appeared.
In which his drawings appeared, and which he'd been using photographs that his authors either had given him, and I would expect he's been adding photographs to what his authors have been sending in. So he's become more photographically literate through writing landscape as well. I don't know if that gets to your question or not.
Donc là, je vais traduire ça en fait. Il y a une autre raison pourquoi il passe à la photographie. Non seulement c'est l'enseignement, mais c'est aussi parce qu'il est éditeur de son magazine, Landscape Magazine, et aussi, donc à partir de ce moment-là, il prend plus de photos. Parce qu'en fait, à cause de son rôle d'éditeur, donc c'était pas seulement as an éducateur.
Yes, sir.
I'm Kim Sorwig. I'm here at the university in the landscape program. One of the things I think many people agree on about landscape is how multivalent it is. It comprises so many different things in any view or analysis that is very hard to categorize. I thought it was quite striking that Jackson seemed to file everything away under a single heading per slide. Nowadays, when you've got something like Lightroom, you have a photograph in there, and you have umpteen keywords, and when you go to prepare a lecture, you put in the keyword, all of the slides pop up that happen to have something to do with that. But I'm curious what you think it represents in Jackson's work, that he did categorize things so simply and under single headings.
Okay.
Je traduis, il discute de la manière dont Jackson classifiait ses diapos. Donc aujourd'hui, quand surtout sur une diapositive sur le paysage, les gens vont utiliser des mots-clés, plusieurs mots-clés pour une image, pour une diapo. Alors que Jackson ne fait pas du tout ça, il avait un seul mot, une seule catégorie pour chaque diapositive. Donc c'est la question, pourquoi faisait-il ça alors qu'en fait, aujourd'hui, ce n'est pas du tout ce qu'on ferait.
Well, I think one thing is that Jackson was willing to change his mind. As I've shown you, over time, he was in the same slide that had many different categories. But he likes as few categories as possible. He often talked about the classical mind, trying to lump in. I mean, for all 19th century and 20th century middle-class houses, he called either techno-style or, what's the other style? No. Techno-style or, I'm going blank, this is embarrassing. Bio-style. There was bio-style and so he's sort of being like Lewis Mumford, you know, and it's borrowing terms. So, but again, and most historians have 19 different stylistic divisions within techno-style and bio-style. So he did have what you're calling a tendency to want a fewer number of categories. Now, it may just be the style of his mind, but maybe I've got that wrong. Take on that.
En fait, lui, il voulait le moins de catégories possibles, mais aussi, il avait aussi le choix de changer ces catégories. Donc en fait, même si on avait peu, il changeait d'avis et après, il les classifiait différemment. Mais par exemple, pour les maisons, plutôt que d'avoir, je ne sais pas, 10 styles différents, il avait seulement 2 catégories, techno-style et bio-style. Et bio-style. Donc il avait seulement 2 catégories alors qu'il aurait pu en avoir 10 par exemple, mais c'était son désir vraiment d'avoir le moins de catégories possible.
Somebody else had their. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Jordi, can you develop the way you think Jackson used the term or the concept,
It's really difficult question. I think that his conception of vernacular changed with the time. In the archive, I could work mainly on documents, talk, and conference presentation from the late 70s to mid 80s. And I was surprised that he linked very strongly vernacular and proletariat, I don't know, proletariat category or working class. And it is shows the link between vernacular and mobility, and he drew a link between the first cottage houses and the mobile homes. But I think that there is a precarity, some precarious in the sense of vernacular for Jackson, and the sense of mobility in it, and that vernacular belongs to the working class society.
Bon, alors,
En français, maintenant.
oui, mais je ne vais pas le traduire quand même.
Et je pense que j'ai eu accès dans les archives qui sont actuellement à l'Université du Nouveau-Mexique, essentiellement à des textes qui datent du milieu de la fin des années 70 jusqu'au milieu des années 90. Et dans ces textes, Jackson fait clairement un lien entre le prolétariat, les classes sociales les plus précaires et souvent les migrants, en fait, et le vernaculaire. Et il fait un lien également entre le vernaculaire appartient en fait à ceux qui n'ont pas d'attache très effective, qui n'ont pas un ancrage très fort avec le lieu. Et c'est comme ça qu'il fait le lien entre les cottages en Angleterre et dans leur sens initial qui appartenaient à des paysans sancerres, en fait, à des métayers, et le vernaculaire qui lie très fortement au mobile home, à toutes les formes d'habitat mobile qui sont très présentes aux États-Unis. Voilà, donc il y a ces deux choses, quelque chose de précaire qui est peu ancré sur la terre, et puis ce lien avec en particulier les migrants et la classe prolétaire.
Paul, do you have?
He said it all.
All right.
Yeah. Supposing is making me really more and more curious about the relation between Jackson and photography, art world photography. And one thing that's now really striking me is, two sides of the same coin. Is one, there's no way Jackson was not totally aware and influenced by what happens. He's set in that total milieu, New York, Harvard. Oh, I think that's where he's coming from. We never hear him mention it, do we? He credits French geography, but when you think about both that kind of dignified, the subject matter that's dignified stance, that's a really interesting laugh. Or again, he was not. We know doesn't say everything about what he was thinking. And then related to Evans, I also find it interesting, I hadn't thought about it before, Jackson didn't use postcards. I mean, and again, that kind of an incredibly ecumenical embrace of the American landscape and a straightforward presentation. Most of us, I think, who touched about the American landscape love these postcards. And certainly he would have been surrounded by them. But then finally, when a lot of the images that we're seeing here, they're Friedlanders, they're all these crazy angles. I'm not sure if I agree by what you're saying about the mirrors. Did you ever recall him consciously saying he's using the mirrors, or is, we all know that the pictures, we're driving and it's taking the mirrors. I'm curious whether you actually.
I never asked him about it.
Yeah.
But the mirrors are in the the side of the pickup truck, you have an image of this piece of the car, and it happens too often for him, and he keeps the slides. He doesn't throw them away. Most of us say, damn, that slide in the car. So in one sense, I think, I never talked to him about it. There's hundreds of things I never talked to him about. The other thing is that he keeps his cards very close to his desk. He doesn't like to say very often what his methods are and who his inspirations and what Walker Evans meant to him. And things of that sort are private. And in conversation at his house, he would be happy to talk about that. But I don't, I think that's again the nature of the man.
Donc le commentaire, c'est que Jerry Jackson est influencé par d'autres grands photographes américains comme Walker Evans, mais qu'en fait il n'en parle pas. Alors c'est clair qu'en fait il était influencé par ces photographes. Aussi, ce qui est quelque chose que d'autres grands photographes ont fait et que lui n'a pas fait, il n'utilise pas du tout de carte postale quand il enseigne. C'est-à-dire que non seulement il avait ses propres diapos, ses propres photos, il prenait aussi des photos qui avaient déjà été publiées dans des livres, mais il n'utilise pas de carte postale, ce qui se faisait par d'autres photographes. Et Paul répond que oui, dans les discussions privées, il ne disait pas en fait quel photographe l'avait influencé, il n'en discutait pas. Alors que c'est clair qu'il était tout à fait au courant de tous ces autres photographes qui l'avaient précédé.
Thank you all very much. Important informational points. If you haven't seen yet, you have a double-sided map in your conference packet. One side has restaurants up and down Central, mostly for dinner choices. The other side has the campus map with the 3 venues where events take place and some suggested nearby restaurants with good, quickly prepared food. I'll just point out that Jordy's curated exhibit of Jackson's slides, you may have already found this in this building. You can visit Zimmerman Library with their sampling of the J.B. Jackson and Chester Leaves collections. The exhibit at the Art Museum will not open until 5 today, so it's not available at lunch, but it will open for our reception this evening. And our landscape architecture program has installed an exhibit of student work on what we call the crit bridge, the criticism of the pinup bridge. And I'll just say that our 5th semester Master of Landscape Architecture students do what we call the competition studio. They always enter a national or international competition. They regularly win and place in both student and open categories. So we're very proud of their work, and those examples are from those competitions. In terms of the funding of this conference, I just want to acknowledge that from the UNM side, over half the funding came from the George Pearl Endowment. This building is named after him, distinguished architect, historic preservationist, and intellectual, who was a fan of J.B. Jackson. And that you may want to visit the library on the 4th floor there, because there are reading rooms dedicated to the spirit of both Jackson and George Pearl in the southeast corner of the building. We'll reconvene at 1:45.